Serafina Blackthorne collapsed on the wooden platform at Willow Creek Station, her bruised body too broken to stand as the westbound train pulled away in a cloud of steam and dust. The morning sun cast long shadows across her crumpled form. Her carpet bag lay beside her like a loyal dog. The other passengers stepped around her. Their boots echoed hollow on the weathered planks. No one stopped. No one looked back. Joaquin Esperanza had come for supplies. His wagon creaked to a halt near the station house. The sight of the woman stopped him cold. She was African American, young, with dark skin that couldn't hide the purple bruises blooming across her cheekbone. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. The station master swept his porch, pointedly ignoring the collapsed figure. A traveling salesman spat tobacco juice and muttered something under his breath. The words carried on the wind like poison. Joaquin stepped down from his wagon. His boots thudded against the platform. The woman stirred but didn't open her eyes. Her breathing was shallow, labored. Dried blood crusted the corner of her mouth. He knelt beside her. Up close, he could see she was maybe 25. Pretty, despite the damage. Her hands were soft but calloused in strange places. Not the hands of a field worker. Not the hands of a house servant either. The station master stopped sweeping. His eyes narrowed. The traveling salesman paused his chewing. Even the horses seemed to sense the weight of the moment. Joaquin slipped his arms under the woman's shoulders and knees. She was lighter than expected, fragile as bird bones. He lifted her against his chest and carried her toward his wagon. Her head lolled against his shoulder. Behind him, whispers started like brush fire. The station master shook his head. The traveling salesman spat again. But Joaquin didn't turn around. He settled the woman in his wagon bed, cushioned by feed sacks. Her carpet bag went beside her. The ride back to his ranch took an hour. The woman didn't wake. Sometimes she moaned when the wagon hit a rut. Her fever burned through her torn dress. Whatever had happened to her, it was recent. The bruises were fresh. Joaquin's ranch sat in a valley between two ridges. Adobe buildings clustered around a central courtyard. Cottonwoods lined the creek that gave the property its name. It had been his family's land for 3 generations. Now lawyers threatened to take it away with papers he couldn't read properly. His sister Maria came out of the main house. She was wiping her hands on her apron, flour dusting her sleeves. When she saw the woman in the wagon, her face went stone. Cold, Tobias Ironwood emerged from the barn. He was a tall, lean man with gray threading his black hair. Scars crossed his back from another life, another time. He'd been working for Joaquin for 5 years now. The best foreman in the territory, and the most careful. Tobias took one look at the unconscious woman and stepped closer to the wagon. His dark eyes missed nothing. The bruises, the torn dress, the way she clutched her carpet bag even in sleep. Maria crossed her arms. Her voice was tight as fence wire. She spoke in Spanish, rapid and angry. Joaquin answered in English, his tone gentle but firm. Whatever he said made Maria throw up her hands and storm back into the house. Tobias helped carry the woman inside. They put her in the small room off the kitchen. It had been a servant's quarters once, back when the ranch could afford servants. Now it mostly stored Maria's preserves. The woman's eyes fluttered open as they settled her on the narrow bed. They were brown, intelligent, and absolutely terrified. She tried to sit up. Failed. Tried again. Joaquin stepped back, hands raised, to show he meant no harm. Tobias moved to the window, giving her space but staying alert. The woman's gaze darted between them like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. Her voice came out as a whisper. Hoarse, like she'd been screaming. She said her name was Sarah Brown. The words felt rehearsed. Too careful. Tobias brought water and clean rags. The woman flinched when he approached but didn't refuse help. She cleaned her own wounds with steady hands. Professional hands, like she'd done this before. Maria returned with soup and fresh bread. She set the tray down without speaking, but her eyes held questions. Dangerous questions about what happened to women who traveled alone. About what happened to men who helped them. The woman ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned not to waste food. Between bites, she studied the room, the thick adobe walls, the single door, the window that faced the courtyard. When she finished eating, she thanked them. Her voice was educated, refined, not what anyone expected from a woman who'd collapsed. At a frontier train station, she asked no questions about where she was or who they were. That was strange too. Joaquin left her to rest. In the courtyard, Maria cornered him. Her whispers were sharp as broken glass. This woman would bring trouble. Everyone who saw him take her from the station would remember. Talk would spread like wildfire. Tobias said nothing, but his silence held weight. He'd survived by reading danger in the wind. Now his weathered face showed concern. That evening, Deputy Weston Pike rode up to the ranch. He was young, ambitious, and mean as a stepped-on rattler. His badge gleamed in the lamplight. His questions came wrapped in false friendliness. He'd heard about the woman. Wondered if Joaquin knew anything about her. There'd been talk in town. A federal marshal was asking questions about a dangerous woman. A black widow, they called her. Someone who left dead husbands in her wake. Pike's horse stamped and snorted. The deputy's hand rested casual-like on his gun belt. His smile never reached his eyes. He'd be back, he said. Just keeping the peace. After Pike rode away, the ranch felt different. Smaller. The darkness pressed closer against the windows. Even the coyotes seemed quieter. In her small room, the woman called Sarah Brown sat on the edge of her bed. Her carpet bag was open beside her. Papers rustled in the lamplight. Legal documents covered with careful handwriting. Maps marked with routes and safe houses. She was reading by candlelight when the cattle started dying. Dawn broke gray and cold across the valley. 3 cattle lay dead near the creek. Their bodies were stiff with frost and something worse. Disease had found the herd. Joaquin stood over the closest carcass. The steer's eyes were clouded white. Foam dried around its muzzle. He'd seen this sickness before. It spread fast and killed faster. Tobias emerged from the barn carrying rope and shovels. His face was grim as winter stone. They'd need to burn the bodies before the rot spread. Quarantine the rest of the herd. Hope it wasn't too late. Sarah Brown appeared at the edge of the courtyard. She moved differently now. Less like prey, more like someone taking measure of her surroundings. Her bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows. Her eyes were sharp as cut glass. She walked toward the dead cattle. Joaquin moved to stop her, but she was already kneeling beside the first steer. Her hands moved over the animal's body with practiced certainty. She examined its mouth, its hooves, the pattern of foam around its nose. When she stood, her expression was thoughtful. She walked back toward the house without a word. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying a canvas bag. Inside were dried herbs wrapped in cloth bundles. Plants Joaquin didn't recognize. She pointed toward the creek. Her voice was steady, certain. The water was poisoned. Not by human hands, but by something upstream. Copper runoff from old mining claims. The cattle were dying of metal sickness, not disease. Tobias studied her with new interest. This woman knew things, dangerous things, useful things. Sarah mixed her herbs in Maria's largest pot. The kitchen filled with bitter steam that made their eyes water. She boiled the mixture down to a dark tea that smelled of earth and iron. Then she walked back to the surviving cattle. The healthy steers were already showing signs, listless movement. Drooping heads, Sarah poured her medicine into their water troughs. Mixed it with grain and molasses to mask the taste. Joaquin watched her work. Her movements were efficient, purposeful. These weren't the actions of a simple widow fleeing trouble. This woman had education, training, skills that didn't match her story. By evening, the cattle were improving. Their eyes cleared, their appetites returned. Sarah's medicine had worked where everything else failed. Maria served dinner in silence. Her earlier hostility had shifted to wary curiosity. This mysterious woman had saved their livelihood. But questions hung in the air, thick as wood smoke. 2 days later, Federal Marshal Cornelius Grimm rode into Willow Creek. He was a tall man with pale eyes and hands that stayed too close to his weapons. His horse was lathered with sweat despite the cool morning. Grimm carried wanted posters. In his saddlebags, the sketches were crude but recognizable. A woman's face. African American. Young. The reward was substantial enough to make honest men consider dishonest choices. He visited the saloon first, then the general store. Finally, the station where Joaquin had found Sarah collapsed on the platform. The station master remembered everything. The woman. The Mexican rancher who'd carried her away. The direction they'd traveled. Word spread through town faster than prairie fire. The Black Widow was here, in their valley, hiding at the Esperanza Ranch. Deputy Pike found Grimm at the hotel that evening. They spoke in low voices over whiskey and cards. Pike's badge caught the lamplight. His smile was sharp as a skinning knife. At the ranch, Sarah sat by her window watching shadows move across the courtyard. She'd heard horses on the main road, seen riders silhouetted against the ridge. Her time was running short. She opened her carpet bag and pulled out the papers she'd been hiding. Legal documents covered with careful writing, deeds and contracts and certificates. Maps marked with routes in safe houses. Names of families who'd made the journey north. Joaquin found her burning papers in the kitchen stove. The flames turned her face into planes of light and shadow. Her hands shook as she fed document after document to the fire. He grabbed her wrist, gently but firm enough to stop her. The papers scattered across Maria's clean floor. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, property deeds. All bearing different names, all in Sarah's careful handwriting. The truth hung between them heavy as storm clouds. This woman wasn't Sarah Brown. She wasn't a simple widow fleeing bad luck. She was something far more dangerous. She pulled her hand free and continued feeding papers to the flames. Her voice was steady, but her eyes held decades of pain. She told him about the 3 men who'd died. Her husbands, all of them. Good men who'd tried to protect her work. The first had been shot helping a family reach the Colorado border. The second died in a fire that wasn't accidental. The third took a beating meant for her and never woke up. That's how she'd earned the name Black Widow. Not for killing, but for surviving. For continuing the work that had cost 3 good men their lives. Joaquin sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm with residual heat from the stove. Outside, wind rattled the windows and scattered ash from the burned papers. He didn't ask about the Underground Railroad. Didn't question the forged documents or the coded maps. Instead, he asked about the cattle medicine, where she'd learned to mix healing herbs. Her smile was sad as autumn leaves. Her grandmother had been a root doctor in Louisiana. Taught her which plants could heal and which could harm. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who'd learned to survive by their wits. The last paper curled black and disappeared up the chimney. Sarah closed her carpet bag and stood to leave. Dawn was still hours away, but she wouldn't wait for Marshal Grimm to find her. Joaquin stood too, blocked her path to the door. His voice was quiet but absolute. She wasn't leaving, not alone. Not into the night where men with badges and guns were hunting her. For the first time since he'd found her at the station, Sarah looked truly afraid. Not of him, but for him. This kindness would cost him everything. His ranch, his family, maybe his life. Maria appeared in the doorway. She'd been listening from the hallway. Her nightgown was white as surrender flags, but her eyes burned with quiet fire. She'd made her choice. Tobias emerged from his room carrying his rifle. He moved to the window and peered through the curtains. No riders yet, but they'd come with morning light. The marshal would have his posse organized by then. Sarah looked at the three faces surrounding her. These people barely knew her real name, but they were willing to risk everything. The weight of their faith was almost unbearable. She reached into her carpet bag one final time, pulled out a leather portfolio she'd kept hidden beneath the burned papers. Inside were more documents, legal papers that would change everything. Joaquin couldn't read the flowing script, but Tobias could. His years of freedom had included learning letters. His face went pale as he scanned the first document. It was a property deed. Legal title to 300 acres of prime Colorado grassland. Signed and notarized. Made out to Serafina Blackthorne, widow of Thomas Blackthorne, deceased. The woman they knew as Sarah Brown was legally entitled to more land than Joaquin's entire ranch. Land that had been stolen from her by the same corrupt officials now, trying to take the Speranza property. She wasn't just running from bounty hunters. She was running from a conspiracy that stretched from Texas to Colorado. Men who'd killed her husband and forged documents to steal her inheritance. Marshal Grimm wasn't hunting a criminal. He was eliminating a witness. The kitchen fell silent except for the whisper of dying flames in the stove. Outside, coyotes called across the valley. Their voices carried warnings that echoed off the canyon walls. Serafina Blackthorne closed the portfolio and looked each of them in the eye. Her voice was steady as bedrock when she spoke. She had a plan, dangerous as winter lightning, but it might save them all. The wanted posters showed Sarah Brown, but Sarah Brown had never existed. Only Serafina remained. And Serafina had legal weapons that Marshal Grimm couldn't fight with bullets. Serafina spread the legal documents across Maria's kitchen table. Dawn light filtered through the curtains, turning the papers pale gold. Her real name felt strange on her tongue after weeks of being Sarah Brown. The property deed lay beside Joaquin's ranch papers. 2 families. 2 pieces of stolen land. The same signatures appeared on both sets of fraudulent documents. Tobias traced the names with his finger. His reading had improved over 5 years of freedom, but legal language still twisted around his understanding. Still, the pattern was clear as creek water. Judge Harrison Wade, Attorney Marcus Finch, County Clerk Samuel Morrison. The same men trying to steal Joaquin's ancestral ranch had murdered Seraphine's husband and forged papers to claim her Colorado property. 2 crimes separated by hundreds of miles but connected by greed. Maria poured coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Her earlier fear had transformed into something harder. Anger burned quiet and steady behind her dark eyes. These men had threatened her family's 3-generation legacy. Serafina showed them the marriage certificate. Thomas Blackthorne had been a teacher in Denver. A white man who'd married an educated black woman despite the dangers. He died defending a family, fleeing night riders, beaten to death while Serafina watched from hiding. She pulled up her sleeve. Scars crossed her dark skin in patterns that spoke of ropes and iron, burn marks from brands meant for cattle. The men who'd killed Thomas had tried to mark her as property. She'd escaped, but barely. Joaquin's jaw tightened. His hands clenched and unclenched against the table edge. Violence lived in his blood, inherited from ancestors who'd fought Apache and conquistadors. But violence wouldn't win this battle. Tobias understood the scars better than the others. His own back carried similar geography, different weapons, same hate. He'd learned to read the signs of human cruelty written in flesh and bone. Outside, horses approached on the main road. Not the thunder of a posse, but the measured gait of careful riders. Serafina moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. Marshal Grimm rode beside Deputy Pike. Behind them came Judge Wade himself, his black coat flapping in the morning wind. 3 men confident of their authority, certain of their victory. They stopped at the ranch gate but didn't enter. Grimm shouted across the courtyard. His voice carried the weight of federal law. He demanded the surrender of the fugitive known as Sarah Brown, the woman called the Black Widow. Joaquin stepped onto the porch. His rifle stayed inside, but his stance spoke of readiness. He called back across the dusty yard. No Sarah Brown lived here, only invited guests and family. Judge Wade's horse stamped and snorted. The judge himself sat straight-backed in his saddle, playing the role of lawman bringing justice to the frontier. His theater might have been convincing if Serafina hadn't seen his signature on forged papers. The standoff stretched taut as fence. Wire. Wind blew dust devils across the courtyard. Chickens pecked nervously near the barn. Even the cattle seemed to sense the tension crackling through the air. Pike's hand rested on his gun butt, young and eager to prove himself. The type who shot first and invented justifications later. Grimm was more dangerous because he was smarter. Patient as a rattlesnake in shade, Judge Wade finally spoke. His voice carried the authority of bench and gavel. They had legal warrants. Federal jurisdiction superseded local preferences. The woman would be surrendered or they'd take her by force. Maria appeared beside Joaquin, then Tobias. 3 people standing against federal authority. The odds were impossible, but they stood anyway. Sometimes standing was all that mattered. Serafina joined them on the porch. Not Sarah Brown the fugitive, but Serafina Blackthorne, the property owner. She carried her leather portfolio and walked with the dignity of someone who owned the ground beneath her feet. Marshal Grimm's pale eyes narrowed. He recognized her from the wanted posters, but something in her bearing gave him pause. This wasn't a cowering criminal begging for mercy. She opened the portfolio and pulled out papers. Her voice carried across the courtyard clear as church bells. She was Serafina Blackthorne, legal owner of 300 acres in Colorado Territory. The charges against her were fabricated by men who'd murdered her husband and stolen her property. Judge Wade's face went white as bleached bone. The legal documents in Seraphine's hands were copies, but they were exact copies. Perfect forgeries. Created by the same woman who'd helped dozens of families forge freedom papers. She'd learned more than herb medicine from her grandmother. She'd learned to fight fire with fire, to forge documents that could free slaves or trap corrupt officials. Skills passed down through generations of women who'd survived by their wits. Grimm urged his horse forward. His hand moved toward his weapon, but Tobias was already moving. Rifle appearing from somewhere behind the porch post. The marshal's horse shied sideways, breaking the moment's tension. Deputy Pike drew his gun. Maria screamed. Joaquin pushed Serafina behind him. The courtyard exploded into motion and shouting, and the sound of hammers being thumbed back on rifles. But no shots fired, not yet. Tobias held his rifle steady but not aimed. Pike's gun wavered between targets. Grimm controlled his spooked horse with professional skill. Judge Wade sat frozen in his saddle, watching his carefully laid plans crumble. Serafina stepped around Joaquin. Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade through silk. She had copies of every forged document in the county clerk's office. Bills of sale that transferred her property to fictional buyers. Deeds that gave the Esperanza Ranch to men who'd never seen it. All bearing the same signatures. All notarized by the same corrupt officials. All illegal under federal law. The papers were hidden in 3 different locations. If anything happened to her, they'd be delivered to the territorial governor, the federal attorney general, newspaper editors in Denver and Santa Fe. Judge Wade found his voice, demanded to know where the copies were hidden. threatened federal prosecution for obstruction of justice. But his bluster rang hollow now. The hunter had become the hunted. Serafina smiled. The expression transformed her face. From pretty to beautiful. She wouldn't tell them about the copies, but she'd make them a deal. They could ride away now, and she'd consider keeping quiet. Or they could try to take her by force and face the consequences. The morning sun climbed higher. Sweat beaded on Pike's forehead despite the cool air. His gun hand trembled slightly. He was young enough to believe in the righteousness of his badge, old enough to recognize when he was on the wrong side. Grim made the decision. He holstered his weapon and gathered his reins. Judge Wade sputtered protests, but the marshal had seen enough. This woman was dangerous in ways bullets couldn't touch. They rode away without another word. Dust clouds marked their retreat toward town. But they'd be back with more men and different tactics. This was only the first skirmish in a longer war. On the porch, 4 people stood in the aftermath of violence that hadn't quite happened. The silence felt fragile as blown glass. One wrong word could shatter everything. Joaquin turned to face Serafina. His eyes held questions that had no safe answers. She'd saved them all with legal papers and pure nerve. But she'd also made enemies of men who killed witnesses and burned evidence. She met his gaze without flinching. Her hand found his and squeezed. Gently, no words passed between them, but understanding flowed deeper than speech. They were bound together now by shared danger and mutual trust. Tobias lowered his rifle. His scarred hands shook slightly as adrenaline faded. He'd been ready to die for a woman whose real name he'd learned 5 minutes ago. The mathematics of loyalty rarely made sense. Maria touched Seraphine's shoulder. The gesture was small but significant. Another bridge built across the chasm of fear and misunderstanding. They were family now, chosen family forged in crisis. The sun reached its zenith. Somewhere in town, Marshal Grimm was planning his next move. Judge Wade was destroying evidence and preparing lies. Deputy Pike was questioning everything he believed about justice and law. But here in the courtyard, 4 people had found something worth fighting for. Not just land or property or legal documents. They'd found each other in the ruins of their separate losses. The war was just beginning. 3 days passed in deceptive quiet. The ranch felt suspended between heartbeats, waiting for the next blow to fall. Serafina worked beside Joaquin, mending fence lines and checking cattle. Her hands grew calloused from honest labor. They spoke little during the long hours under the desert sun. Words felt dangerous now, too easily overheard by watching eyes. But their bodies learned to communicate in glances and shared tasks. Trust built itself in increments of sweat and silence. Maria watched them from the kitchen window. Her brother moved differently around this woman. Lighter somehow, despite the weight of danger pressing down on all their shoulders. Love was growing between them like wildflowers after rain. Tobias rode the property boundaries twice daily. His eyes searched ridgelines and creek beds for signs of watchers. Marshal Grimm wouldn't give up easily. Men like him never admitted defeat, only changed tactics. On the 4th morning, riders appeared on the eastern ridge. Too far away to count, but close enough to send a message. They were being watched, measured, prepared for like prey animals marked for slaughter. Serafina found Joaquin shoeing horses. In the barn. She stood in the doorway, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. He looked up from the anvil, sweat beading his forehead, hammer suspended in mid-swing. The moment stretched between them taut as heated metal. Then she crossed the space separating them and placed her hand against his chest. His heart hammered against her palm faster than his work rhythm. He set down the hammer, reached up to touch her face with fingers still warm from the forge. Her skin was soft despite the sun and wind, beautiful despite the fading bruises that had brought her into his life. She rose on her toes and kissed him. Not the desperate kiss of people facing death, but something deeper. A promise made without words. A commitment that transcended the immediate danger surrounding them. When they broke apart, Maria was standing in the barn doorway. Her expression was unreadable as stone, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she stepped forward into the shadowed space. Her voice was quiet but firm. She'd been thinking about the legal documents, about Judge Wade's fear when Serafina revealed her evidence. There was a way to use that fear, but it would require all of them working together. The territorial courthouse sat in Willow Creek's town square. Records were kept in the basement vault. If they could get inside, photograph the original forged documents, they'd have proof that would destroy the conspiracy. Tobias emerged from a horse stall, curry brush in hand. He'd been listening from the shadows. The plan was possible but dangerous. The courthouse was watched now. Grimm had men positioned throughout town. Serafina pulled out her leather portfolio. Inside were tools she'd hoped never to use again. Lockpicks wrapped in soft leather. Tiny bottles of chemicals for detecting forged ink. A small camera her husband had taught her to operate. She'd broken into county offices before, copying records that could free enslaved families or expose corrupt officials. Her grandmother's herb knowledge had extended to other useful skills. Ways to move unseen through a world that wanted to keep her invisible. The plan took shape through whispered conversations over evening meals. Serafina would enter the courthouse through the basement window. Tobias would create a distraction at the saloon, drawing attention away from the square. Joaquin and Maria would wait with horses at the edge of town. 2 more days passed in preparation. They studied the courthouse from different angles, noting guard positions and patrol schedules. Deputy Pike made regular rounds, but he was predictable. Lazy enough to take shortcuts when he thought no one was watching. The night they chose was moonless and cloudy, perfect for moving unseen through shadowed streets. Serafina dressed in dark clothes and soft-soled boots. Her tools fit into a small canvas bag that made no sound when she moved. They rode into town separately, taking different routes. Joaquin and Maria positioned themselves near the livery stable. Tobias headed for the saloon, where oil lamps spilled golden light onto the wooden sidewalk. Serafina approached the courthouse from behind, using the undertaker's building for cover. The basement window was barred, but the bars were old iron, weakened by years of weather. Her lockpicks made quick work of the simple mechanism. Inside, the basement smelled of dust and old paper. Filing cabinets lined the walls in military precision. She lit her small oil lamp and began searching for the property records. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency through folders and documents. She found the Esperanza Ranch papers first. The original deed was authentic, dating back 50 years. But attached were newer documents transferring ownership to Marcus Finch, the corrupt attorney. The signatures were obvious forgeries, the ink too fresh for the supposed dates. Her own property records were harder to locate, hidden behind unrelated files, as if someone had tried to bury them. The forged deed gave her Colorado land to a fictional corporation. Judge Wade's signature was slightly different from his authentic documents, betraying the deception. She photographed everything with her small camera. Each image had to be perfect, because there wouldn't be another chance. The chemical flash powder made tiny puffs of light that seemed loud as gunshots in the silent basement. Above her, footsteps crossed the courthouse floor. Heavy boots that belonged to more than one man. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Someone had discovered her presence. The basement door opened. Light spilled down the wooden stairs in a yellow rectangle. Marshal Grimm's voice carried through the darkness, asking questions she couldn't quite hear. Another voice answered. Deputy Pike, nervous and uncertain. Serafina extinguished her lamp and pressed herself against the filing cabinets. The basement window was 20 feet away across open floor, too far to reach without being seen. She was trapped in a room full of evidence, with nowhere to run. Footsteps descended the stairs. 2 sets now, moving with the confidence of hunters closing on cornered prey. Marshal Grimm appeared in the lamplight, his pale eyes scanning the basement shadows. Pike followed behind him, gun drawn but trembling. She held her breath and tried to become part of the darkness. Her camera and tools felt heavy as anvils in her canvas bag. If they found her here with the evidence, everything was finished. Not just for her, but for all of them. Grimm moved methodically through the basement, checking behind cabinets and in corners. His experience showed in every careful step. This was a man who'd tracked fugitives across half the continent. Pike stayed near the stairs, blocking the only exit. His youth worked against him. Now, fear made him jumpy, dangerous in the way of rattlesnakes and loaded weapons. One wrong sound could trigger violence. A commotion erupted outside, shouting voices and running feet. Through the basement window came the orange glow of fire. Tobias had created his distraction, but perhaps too well. The whole town seemed to be mobilizing. Grimm cursed it and headed for the stairs. The fire took precedence over hunting shadows. Pike followed, but he paused at the basement door and looked back. His young face was troubled, as if he'd begun questioning the righteousness of this hunt. When their footsteps faded, Serafina moved. She crossed the basement floor in 3 quick strides and reached the window. Her lockpicks opened it from the inside. She squeezed through the narrow opening and found herself in the alley behind the courthouse. Fire lit the night sky above the saloon. Not a real fire, she realized, but Tobias burning wet straw and green wood to create impressive smoke. The whole town had turned out with buckets and blankets, creating perfect chaos for escape. She made it to the livery stable where Joaquin waited with horses. Maria sat her mount with the grace of someone born to the saddle. All 3 of them were pale with tension, but alive and free. They rode out of town as the false fire died down to smoldering embers. Behind them, Marshal Grimm would soon discover the basement break-in. He'd know they had evidence now, proof of the conspiracy that could destroy him and his allies. The war had escalated. No more standoffs in dusty courtyards. No more polite threats delivered from horseback. Now it was hunter. And hunted through the desert night, with everything they loved hanging in the balance. But Seraphine's camera held the truth. Photographic evidence that Judge Wade and his accomplices had forged legal documents and stolen property. Evidence that could set them all free, if they lived long enough to use it. The chase was about to begin in earnest. They rode hard through the desert night, putting miles between themselves and Willow Creek. The photographs in Seraphine's saddlebags bounced against her horse's flank with each gallop. Evidence that could destroy Judge Wade's conspiracy, if they lived long enough to use it. Dawn found them at an abandoned mining camp in the foothills. Wooden buildings sagged against each other, empty windows staring across a valley littered with rusted equipment. Tobias scouted the perimeter while the others watered their horses at a half-collapsed well. Serafina developed the photographs in the darkness of a windowless shack. The chemicals stung her eyes and turned the air bitter, but the images emerged. Clear and damning. Judge Wade's forged signatures. Marcus Finch's fraudulent transfers. County Clerk Morrison's falsified dates. She laid the wet photographs on a broken table to dry. In the pale morning light, the evidence looked fragile as autumn leaves. But these pieces of paper could topple an empire built on stolen land and murdered witnesses. Joaquin studied the images with growing amazement. His own family's deed altered to transfer ownership to men who'd never set foot on the ranch. Seraphine's Colorado property sold to a corporation that existed only on paper. The scope of the theft was breathtaking. Maria counted their remaining supplies. Food for maybe 2 days, water for 3 if they were careful. They couldn't return to the ranch now. Grimm would have men watching every approach, waiting with rifles and federal warrants. A dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon. Riders, moving fast toward their position. Too many to fight, too close to outrun. Serafina gathered the photographs and stuffed them into her shirt. The others grabbed weapons and took positions behind the mining camp's crumbling walls. But the approaching riders flew a white flag. Marshal Grimm rode at their head, but Deputy Pike was conspicuously absent. Behind Grimm came Judge Wade and a dozen armed men. Not a posse pursuing fugitives, but a delegation seeking negotiation. They stopped 50 yards from the mining camp. Grimm dismounted and walked forward alone, hands visible and empty. His pale eyes swept the abandoned buildings, cataloging defensive positions and escape routes. He was too experienced to believe this was simple surrender. His voice carried across the desert silence. He offered safe passage out of the territory. In exchange for the photographs, Judge Wade was prepared to compensate them for their trouble. A generous settlement that would let everyone start fresh somewhere else. Serafina appeared on the porch of the largest building. She held one photograph high enough for Grimm to see. The image of Judge Wade's forged signature, clear as a confession written in ink and betrayal. Her response echoed off the canyon walls. The photographs were already on their way to Santa Fe, copies hidden in 3 locations, just as she'd promised days ago. Killing them now would only ensure the evidence reached federal prosecutors. Judge Wade spurred his horse forward. His black coat flapped in the desert wind as he shouted across the distance. The photographs were stolen property, inadmissible. In any court, she was a fugitive wanted for federal crimes. No prosecutor would believe the word of a criminal over a respected judge. Tobias stepped into view beside Serafina. Then Joaquin. Finally Maria. 4 people standing against a dozen armed men and the full weight of corrupt authority. The odds were impossible, but they stood anyway. A new dust cloud appeared from the east. A single rider pushing his horse to the limit of endurance. Deputy Pike, his young face grim with purpose and terrible understanding. He'd spent the night reviewing courthouse records, following the trail of forged documents and stolen property. Pike dismounted near Marshal Grimm. The 2 men spoke in urgent whispers while Judge Wade watched with growing alarm. Whatever Pike had discovered, it wasn't good news for the conspiracy. The deputy pulled out a leather folder thick with official papers, federal warrants signed by territorial prosecutors. Not for Serafina or her allies, but for Judge Wade, Marcus Finch, and County Clerk Morrison. Charges of conspiracy, fraud, and murder in federal jurisdiction. Grimm's face went pale as desert sand. He'd been hunting the wrong people, following orders from men who'd been lying to him from the beginning. The Federal Marshal Service didn't protect corrupt judges, it prosecuted them. Judge Wade saw his empire crumbling and made a desperate choice. His hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but he was too slow and too obvious. Pike's weapon cleared leather first, steady despite his youth and the magnitude of what he was doing. The standoff stretched taut as piano wire. A dozen men with guns drawn, facing each other across 50 yards of desert scrub. One wrong move would turn the mining camp into a battlefield where nobody would survive. Serafina walked down from the porch. Slowly, deliberately, with her hands visible but not raised in surrender. She crossed the open ground between the buildings and the mounted men, every step an act of faith in justice and human decency. She stopped beside Deputy Pike and held out the photographs. Her voice was calm as still water when she spoke. These were copies. The originals were already in federal hands, along with testimony from witnesses across 3 territories. The conspiracy was finished whether they fought or surrendered. Judge Wade's gun wavered between targets. His face was red with rage and desperation. Everything he'd built through years of careful corruption was collapsing around him. Men like him didn't surrender gracefully. Marshal Grimm made the choice for all of them. He holstered his weapon and stepped between Pike and the judge. His voice carried the authority of federal law when he placed Judge Wade under arrest. The other armed men lowered their weapons, recognizing the shift in power. Wade's gun clattered to the ground. His hands shook as Pike applied iron shackles to his wrists. The man who'd sat behind the bench dispensing twisted justice was now just another prisoner facing trial for his crimes. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the desert chill. Serafina stood beside Joaquin in the ruins of the mining camp, watching as justice finally began to unfold. Not perfect justice, but better than they'd dared hope for. Marshal Grimm approached them with something approaching respect. He'd been manipulated by corrupt officials, used as a weapon against innocent people. That knowledge sat heavy on his shoulders, aging him years in the span of minutes. He apologized without making excuses, offered federal protection during the upcoming trials, promised that the stolen property would be restored to its rightful owners. Words that meant everything and nothing, depending on whether they were followed by appropriate actions. Deputy Pike unlocked Judge Wade's handcuffs long enough to let him sign documents, restoring the Esperanza Ranch to Joaquin's family. Then Serafin's Colorado property, returned with interest and damages. The pen scratched across paper with the sound of justice being served. Maria embraced her brother in the shadow of the abandoned mine buildings. Their family's legacy was secure again, but more than that, they'd found the courage to fight for what was right. That knowledge would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Tobias shook hands with Deputy Pike, two men who'd chosen the difficult path of standing up to corruption. The deputy was young enough to build a career on honest law enforcement. Tobias was old enough to know how rare and precious that choice really was. Serafina and Joaquin stood apart from the others, watching dust devils dance across the desert floor. Their love had been forged in crisis and tested by danger. Now they faced the different challenge of building a life together in peacetime. She reached for his hand. He took it without hesitation. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The woman who'd collapsed at the train station had found her strength. The man who'd carried her away had found his purpose. The desert wind carried the scent of rain from distant mountains. New growth was coming to the valley, nourished by storms and watered by hope. The future stretched ahead of them bright as sunrise. The territorial judge arrived from Santa Fe 3 weeks later. He was an older man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much frontier justice. His gavel fell like thunder in the Willow Creek courthouse, pronouncing sentences that would reshape the territory. Judge Wade received 20 years in federal prison. Marcus Finch got 15. County Clerk Morrison faced 10 years and forfeiture of all assets. The conspiracy that had stolen land and murdered innocents crumbled under the weight of photographic evidence and witness testimony. Serafina sat in the front row watching justice unfold. Her legal documents were restored and validated. Her Colorado property was returned with interest payments that would fund a comfortable future. More importantly, her name was cleared of all charges. The territorial judge's final act was signing the marriage license. Joaquin Esperanza and Serafina Blackthorne, united in law as they had been united in struggle. The document bore official seals and authentic signatures, unlike the forgeries that had brought them together. Deputy Pike pinned on a new badge. That afternoon, Sheriff Pike now, elected by townspeople who had witnessed his courage in standing against corruption. His first official act was hiring Tobias Ironwood as his deputy. Justice deserved protectors who understood the cost of injustice. The wedding took place on an October morning when the cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold as Spanish coins. The entire valley seemed to celebrate, from the cattle lowing in the pastures to the hawks circling overhead in the clear blue sky. Maria wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame. She stood beside Tobias at the altar they'd built under the largest cottonwood. Their own love had grown quietly in the shadow of more dramatic events, but it was no less real for being understated. Seraphine's dress was simple white cotton, but she wore her grandmother's pearls and her mother's wedding ring. 3 generations of strong women had contributed to this moment. Their spirits seemed to dance in the autumn sunlight filtering through the leaves. Joaquin had never looked more handsome than he did, standing beside the creek where his family had drawn water for 50 years. His hands were steady as he placed the ring on Seraphine's finger. His voice was strong as he spoke the vows they'd written together. The ceremony was conducted by a circuit preacher who'd ridden 2 days to perform the service. He was an old man who'd seen the territory change from wilderness to civilization. These weddings gave him hope that the future would be kinder than the past. Children from the neighboring ranches scattered flower petals as the couples walked back toward the house. White and yellow blooms carpeted the path, released by small hands that knew nothing of the struggles that had brought this joy into being. The celebration continued into the evening. Musicians played guitars and fiddles while couples danced in the courtyard. The same space where armed men had faced each other in standoff now hosted laughter and music, and the sound of children playing. Serafina danced with her new husband under stars that seemed brighter than usual. His hands were calloused from honest work, scarred from defending what he loved. They were good hands, strong hands that would build rather than destroy. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families from across the valley. People who had once viewed the Esperanza Ranch with suspicion now brought their best dishes and their genuine friendship. Community had grown where fear once lived. Sheriff Pike raised a toast as the evening wore on. To justice served and love triumphant. To the courage of those who stood against corruption. To the future that belonged to people brave enough to fight for it. The months that followed brought changes to the valley. The ranch became a safe haven for families displaced by violence and persecution. Seraphine's medical knowledge and Joaquin's generous heart combined to create something unprecedented on the frontier. They built a school in the spring, with Maria as the teacher and Tobias helping with the older children who needed to learn reading and writing alongside their chores. Education was power, and power shared made the entire community stronger. Serafina established a clinic in one of the ranch's outbuildings. Her grandmother's herbal knowledge, combined with medical training she'd received in Denver, made her the best healer within 100 miles. People traveled from across the territory seeking her help. The railroad brought new opportunities and new challenges. Progress arrived in the form of steel rails and telegraph wires, connecting their valley to the wider world. But progress also brought land speculators and mining companies, eager to exploit the territory's resources. Joaquin and Serafina met each challenge with the same quiet determination that had carried them through their darkest hours. They used their legal knowledge to help neighbors protect their property rights. They used their influence to ensure that development benefited the community rather than outside interests. Deputy Tobias Ironwood became a legend throughout the territory. His fairness and integrity attracted the best type of settlers while discouraging those who came seeking easy prey. The badge he wore represented real justice, not the corrupt authority they'd all fought against. Summer brought their first child, a daughter with her mother's intelligent eyes and her father's gentle strength. They named her Hope for the future she represented. A future where children could grow up free from the prejudices that had scarred their parents' generation. The old mining camp where they'd made their final stand was converted into a way station for travelers. Serafina insisted on providing food and shelter for anyone who needed it, regardless of their background or ability to pay. Kindness, she believed, created more kindness. On quiet evenings, when the day's work was finished and the children were asleep, Serafina and Joaquin would sit on their porch watching the sun set over the valley. The same stars that had witnessed their struggles now shone down on their peace. The woman who had once been too bruised to stand now stood as a pillar of her community. The man who had carried her away from that train station had carried her into a life neither of them could have imagined. Their love had been tested by danger and strengthened by shared purpose. Maria's students grew up to become teachers and doctors and lawyers. They carried the lessons of justice and compassion into the wider world, spreading the values that had been planted in a small valley through the courage of 4 people who refused to surrender to injustice. The railroad brought visitors who wanted to hear the story of the Black Widow who had saved a territory from corruption. Serafina always smiled when they used that name. She had indeed been a widow, 3 times over. But she was a widow who had chosen to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm. Years passed and the valley prospered. The Esperanza Ranch became the heart of a community that welcomed all who came seeking honest work and peaceful lives. The legacy of those who had died protecting others lived on in the sanctuary that Serafina and Joaquin had created. The train still stopped at Willow Creek Station, but now it brought families seeking new beginnings rather than fugitives fleeing old troubles. The platform where Serafina had collapsed was now a place of arrival rather than desperation. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Joaquin and Serafina returned to that platform. They stood hand in hand where their story had begun, surrounded by the children and grandchildren who represented the future they had fought to create. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and new growth. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the moisture that would bring life to the hard ground. Some storms brought destruction, but others brought renewal. They had learned the difference between the two. More importantly, they had learned that love could survive any storm if it was built on the solid foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. The woman who had once been too broken to stand now stood strong, surrounded by the family she had chosen and the community she had helped to build. The future stretched ahead of them bright with possibility. Their children would inherit a world where justice was more than a word, where courage was rewarded, and where love could truly conquer the forces that sought to divide and destroy. The sun set over the valley, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, all was well in the small corner of the world that 4 brave people had claimed for hope and healing. And that is all to the story, for now. Please let me know where you are tuning in from. Perhaps we will create a story there. Consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel. And if you enjoy our content, click this video on your screen. I promise you, it's worth watching. See you tomorrow.